Now, here's your host, Dr. Walter Martin.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Kingdom of the Cults, one in a series of programs dealing with cults and the occult. Today's program, The Kingdom of the Occult, Part 2, deals with a variety of occultic subjects. We'll be traveling to Miami, Florida to talk with Juan Sousa, a Catholic priest who is an expert on the subject of Santeria, an occultic practice which is now flourishing not only in Florida, but in other parts of the United States as well. We'll be speaking with Dr. Charles Whetley, who is the Dade County coroner. He'll not only have some interesting comments, but he'll be showing us some gruesome evidence as well, which will illustrate the point that the subject we are talking about does exist. We'll also speak with a local police official there. And next, Dr. Mercedes Sandoval, an anthropologist in Miami, has some interesting comments about Santeria from a cultural point of view. And Tom Wensky, a Catholic priest, who is an expert on the people-oriented problems of voodoo, has some interesting comments for us also. We'll actually witness part of a voodoo ceremony that was recorded on a sandbar near Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Then we'll conclude this program with some good advice from Dennis Bauer, who is the Assistant District Attorney of Los Angeles County. Dennis will be providing some remarks on the subject of crime and the occult. This is a very important program that every Christian should see and remember with great interest. I have one word of caution, however, if small children are now viewing this program. You may wish to use parental discretion, as some of the scenes we will be showing today, particularly the interview with Dr. Whetley and the voodoo ceremony, are extremely graphic. Before we begin, I believe that we should review our terms. What is the occult? It is simply a synonym for satanic power and phenomena. The occultic practices of Santeria falls into this category. Santeria is popular among Hispanics in general and Cuban Americans in particular. It is a blend of African religion and Christianity, with African gods being worshipped through statues of Catholic saints. It has many similarities to other Afro-Caribbean occultic practices, including voodoo and Palo Mayombe. Because each individual group that practices one of these beliefs is autonomous or separated from one another, there is a great deal of variation and individual interpretation. As far as we know, none of these groups have any of their beliefs or practices in a written form, which makes it difficult to conduct a definitive examination of their religion. Negro slaves, who many years ago were brought to the New World, were discouraged, if not forbidden, to practice the African religions they had grown up with. Spanish and Portuguese masters then introduced them to Christianity. Essentially, as a compromise ensuring cultural and physical survival, the slaves combined both religions. Such a combination is indeed syncretistic. The name Santeria itself is a corruption of saint worship. The gods and goddesses of Santeria are of West African origin, specifically the Yoruba culture of southwestern Nigeria. Santeria is mistakenly considered by its followers to be a good religion, and their priests, or santeros, almost always only practice this type of magic. However, all magic is ultimately evil according to the Bible, deriving its real power from Satan. If someone wants harm done to someone else, they usually consult a Palo Mayombe or Palero priest. All of this is an essential part of the Santeria rituals, as manifested through the offerings of herbs, roots, flowers, and plants. Most of these items can be purchased at botanicas, which can be found throughout the United States. Each of the gods is propitiated or fed his or her favorite food or offered a sacrifice, such as the blood of roosters and goats. Live birds, including pigeons, canaries, and hens, are used in rubbing rituals where the client is cleansed. The idea here is to pass any evil presence into the birds. To get more information on this subject, we had an opportunity to talk with Juan Sousa, a Catholic priest in Miami, who spends a good deal of his time dealing with this problem. Our reporter, Regina Sippel, asked him to provide more insight into the Santeria worship rituals.
They have a consultation process similar to the oracles of Greece, you might say. Two styles. First, 16 shells are used by the Santero priest to cast on the ground to answer some of the questions that perhaps the believer, the devotee, and the Santero would like to ask the gods. Let's say, who is your god protector? And then they cast the shells, and by the way they fall, they can figure out the answer to that. The second style would be the coconuts used by the Babalao, or high priest of Santeria. It's half a coconut divided into 4 parts, and they become like the substitute of the shells. Santeros deal with many priests, many gods and divinities. The Babalao only with the god of the future known as Orula. Herbs are very important because they, according to their belief, they have the power of the gods, Ache, A-C-H-E. And that's, all these tangible symbols have been sort of sanctified, you might say, by their tradition.
Are musical instruments such as drums used in their rituals?
Yes, for Santeria believers and for the slaves in the past, the drum is the voice that calls the gods to come down and take over the personality of the devotee or one of the believers gathered there. It is that musical rhythm that allows them to sort of place themselves in some kind of a trance, which is also aided by alcoholic beverage.
Do they charge for fortune telling and other advice given?
The consultation process depends on the santeros or santeras. I know that commercialism has become one of the key ingredients in Santeria today. A lot of each one stipulates its own charge, you know, which way to pay or how to pay. Initiation rites are extremely expensive, close to 10,000 in some cases. Imposition of necklaces, which is a process of initiation. For each necklace, I believe that they have been charging $175, $200, and they have to be 7 of them, you know, as part of the initiation. So money is somewhat involved, quite a bit involved in the commercial aspect of this religion here in the United States.
Is there a social side to Santeria?
Social? Ethical? I doubt it. It's the initiation itself, for instance, requires, according to the famous taboos studied in books, that the person becomes alienated from other people, that they are to be pure for a whole year, wearing white, and in no way touching anyone, keeping their own utensils and own dishes at home. So social from the point of view of involvement, through the whole initiation process, they're asked not to become social. Now afterwards, to the degree that they simply gather together for worship at various key moments of the year, I cannot see. A lot of people justify their behavior because they claim their gods tell them in the oracles that that's the way they should be. So there's a lot of psychological nuances involved in this aspect.
Are professional people involved in Santeria?
There was a belief at one time that only people belonging to the low-income standards of society or social standards would practice cults like this, or Santeria. It has been discovered that that's not true because, see, faith is not a dimension that is limited to a group of people or because of socio-economic reasons. Yes, they have professors, lawyers, doctors, people who for some critical moment in their life seek refuge and support, may turn to the personal attention that a santero gives them, and at that level they get involved.
Can you describe demonic possession in the Santeria ritual?
Santeria ritual has no demonic possession, and there is no involvement with the devil at all. The devil is Eshu. Eshu is one of the 21 manifestations of one of their gods, that is Elegua. And remember, African mythology and mentality is so different from Western mentality. Elegua is to be feared, and Eshu, the devil, is to be avoided. So Santeria does not handle with evil. There is a similar African religion, the Bantu religion, which in the Caribbean is known as the Regla de Palo, or the Paleros are the priests of this religion, that has the double pantheon of gods for good and gods for evil. And perhaps that group is the one that deals mostly with magical things in terms of evil.
What is Palo Mayombe?
That would be the popular name given to the devotees of the mixture of Bantu religion. Bantu is one of the tribes of that area, Nigeria, and Catholicism, just pretty popular or pretty similar to the Santeria. Remember that many tribes came to the New World, not just all those belonging to one tribe, and Palo Mayombe are kind of as a Spanish version of that other mixture. And Palo Mayombe has a similar structure in terms of rituals and initiation processes as Santeria, but they deal with the divinities of good and the divinities of evil. So that is another one of those tribes.
Is it ever mixed with Santeria?
Oh yes, that's part of the situation of the word syncretism, describes it so much. I know it sounds difficult, but it's a very descriptive word. It means it's a mixture. And when the clarity of faith is not present, people would mix these things up. So therefore, somebody in crisis may go to a santero for attention. And as time goes on, if he thinks his immediate solution to the crisis is not solved and doesn't come through, he may then go to a palero, which would be a priest of this other form of religion, Palo Mayombe, and deal with him at his level, and probably claiming that the santero did not function.
Can you describe what goes on at a botanica?
The botanica does not sell sacred stuff, may I say that, or symbols. The botanica is there for an immediate, maybe buying some herbs, some holy carts that they have, referral center, kind of responding to some of the prescriptions made by the santero. And the real sacred ceremonies are not done there at all. It's a free-for-all type of shop where everything is available.
That was Juan Sousa commenting on some of the odd religious aspects of Santeria. When our staff was in Miami, we also had a chance to interview Dr. Charles Wetley, who is the coroner of Dade County. Dr. Wetley showed us many of the artifacts he had collected along the way during the course of his work. Most of them were gathered as evidence when he went to a death scene to examine a body. First, we asked him how prevalent Santeria is in Miami at this time.
From my own experience investigating a variety of deaths in this community, I can say it's extremely prevalent. It's difficult, for example, to walk down Little Havana without seeing evidence of Santeria on almost every street corner you see. When we go into homes occupied by Latins, it's almost unusual not to see some evidence of Santeria.
You brought some artifacts to show us. Could you tell us this knife and the significance of it?
Well, this knife was found at the site of a grave robbing. I had received a phone call from a woman here in Miami who indicated that her mother-in-law's grave had been desecrated several days earlier, and before they went to the expense of repairing it and so forth, would someone be able to check to see if her mother-in-law was still there for all practical purposes. I went there and discovered upon opening the casket that the head had in fact been stolen. My first impression was this might be related to one of the Afro-Caribbean cults, particularly Palo Mayombe, where they need human remains. And so the first order of business was to look around for something that was black and red, which is a color code for one of their gods, which usually is propitiated first. We looked around, didn't find anything until someone noticed that on the floor of the vault, right near the casket, was this knife. And the knife in itself is important because one of the gods, particularly Ogun, owns the metals and hence is significant in that regard. And our black and red stripes, which we were interested in, are in fact on the handle, alternating black and red. So this confirmed that we were dealing, say, with a religious cult versus malicious mischief, as an example.
What are some of the symbols of Santeria?
Well, Santeria has numerous symbols, the most common of which are statues of Catholic saints. The saints, for example, like the one I'm holding, is of Santa Barbara. And peculiar about her is that she's always holding a sword and a chalice, and her colors are white and red. Now, this doesn't represent a Catholic saint as such. It represents the god Chango, whose colors are red and white, and whose symbol is the sword or the axe. What actually happened is that the Negro slaves, in order to try and preserve their own religion, realized that if they prayed to Chango, they'd be killed by the Spanish. So in order to preserve their lives as well as their religious identity, they underwent a process called syncretism, which means that they represented their gods in the images of Catholic saints. Therefore, when someone entered their room, they're obviously praying to St. Barbara, not to Chango. In fact, they were praying to Chango. So this is a very popular one. We also see it tattooed, for example, on the backs of individuals. You'll have a tattoo of St. Barbara covering an entire back of a person. This is a very popular god in the Santeria religion. Other aspects, for example, Santa Barbara can also have an aggressive aspect. Chang'o is a god of thunder and fire and lightning, much like the god Zeus in Olympic mythology is concerned. In this particular posture with the sword raised, it's more for an aggressive stance for whatever purpose they might actually intend. The horse itself is also significant, and notice also it's a white horse. So that brings up really the other symbols of Santeria, and that is the color codes. Each god has a specific color code. Chang'o, as I mentioned, is red and white. The god Elegua is red and black, and these can be manifested in varying ways, such as the clothing that is worn by an individual. If they're devoted to Elegua, they might be wearing a bright red shirt and black pants, for example. Or if you have a human skull which is being returned to the cemetery, the burlap bag will be tied on one end with red ribbon and the other on with black ribbon. Most commonly, they're associated with beads of varying colors which will represent the various gods. Obatala, for example, would be all white beads with an occasional red bead interspersed in there. Black and red and so forth are the other colors. This is an example of a beaded necklace of Santeria, and this has the colors actually of all the various gods, and the more important ones, which are known as the 7 African powers. Most people who are not high priests and are devoted to one particular deity will have just the necklace of that deity. For example, red and white for Chang'o. They might wear it around their neck, or they might have it in their pocket and so forth. Also, certain religious ceremonies in Santeria require that they carry these beads or wear them on their person. So there are many symbols of Santeria which can become quite evident if you know what to look for. Something of a more personal nature is called a resguardo. And this is usually a pouch which may be sewn to a brassiere or carried in the pocket around the neck or whatever. And this particular one, for example, has the color code of black and red, which is symbolic for Elegua, who controls roads, gates, and communications. Inside this, and I'm not sure I can get it out, inside this is a snail shell which is packed with dirt. Now, the significance of these is something which is personal, of a personal nature, something which is used for protection or devotion to a god and so forth, and it's really impossible to figure out what it means because it only has special meaning for the individual. This particular one was found hanging off the emergency brake of an automobile of a drug dealer who got killed while playing a soccer game. But what the snail shell has meaning for, packed with dirt, is something I don't know. Others may contain lodestones, which are like magnetic stones used for protection, and coins, a bullet, things like that, a lock of hair, and so forth. And again, always color-coded with a particular god. Other things will be various stones, particularly in teardrop-shaped pendants, which are black, and these are thought to not just be a symbolic type of representation of a god, but actually the power and spirit of that god. They would, for example, say, this is not the symbol of Chang'o, this is my Chang'o, my spirit, my power, my Chang'o that works for me. And that is extremely important for these individuals.
Aren't there also a variety of objects that are found in cauldrons?
Well, when you start talking about cauldrons, you're getting more away from Santeria but into the other cult known as Palo Mayombe, which is a black magic cult. It's related to Santeria in that there are many similarities, but the belief system and ceremonies and so forth appear to be quite different. The cult of Palo Mayombe is a cult of the dead, and originally what would happen would be a Palero initiate or high priest initiate would go to a grave and ask the dead person, do you want to be my slave? If the answer is affirmative, he will then, with due ceremony and so forth, go back to the grave and dig the body up and take the long bones as well as the skull, and in place leave something in payment, such as a dead turtle, for example, which some of the gods like. Each of the gods has their own specific propitiation. Some like honey, some like turtles, some like chickens, some like goats, and so forth. And so the payment would be made. The skull ideally should contain some remaining brain so that it can think better and think faster. And this is where the power of the Palero resides, in something he calls the Kiumba. And through the Kiumba, he creates his magical power. In other words, the dead person's spirit now becomes his slave. Obviously, they need skulls for this. In our experience, most of the skulls have been smuggled into the country. Most of them appear to be of large black males, which are not American blacks, Occasionally they've been found to be anatomic specimens like museum specimens or medical school specimens which have been obtained one way or the other. And on rare occasions we've also had instances of grave robbings to obtain the skulls. This one, for example, was found as part of a cauldron which is called an nganga. And as you can see, it's covered entirely with feathers, predominantly chickens or other animals, bird feathers, also blood from the sacrifice of the animals, the wax because a candle was sitting on it at one time. The wax in this case appears to be all white, and if in fact that was the case, this would indicate devotion to the god Obatala, whose color code is pure white. Sometimes you'll find devotion to the god Shango, in which you'll have a mixture of red and white wax. This particular skull appears to be that of a black male, again, not an American black. The skulls may also be interred inside the cauldron, in which case they're frequently covered with rust, and of course impacted with dirt and that kind of thing.
Tell me about this skull.
This particular skull is rather interesting because it was found on the railroad tracks. Now, railroad tracks have a special meaning that railroad tracks are symbolic of one of the gods. When a bolero dies, or decides to get out of the religion, so to speak, or no longer practice it, or for whatever reason, the nganga, or the cauldron, has to be destroyed. Otherwise, the black magic mischief stays around uncontrolled. And therefore, the skulls have to be returned to the grave or someplace that the god directs. This particular skull was found on the railroad track. It has some red staining on it, probably indicative of having been tied up or covered with a red cloth, which suggests that it may have been devoted to Shango. It also is impacted with dirt in many areas and also has a small portion of brain remaining inside of it. The brain, frequently with burial, becomes dehydrated and you wind up with like a mummified portion of brain. It was also left, and found rather, with a cowrie shell. And cowrie shells are of significance because A, they're common in Africa, and B, they're used for divination purposes, and they really have a lot of symbolism associated with Palo Mayombe. So they become very important. Also, the skull was found in association with 2 pennies, which seemed a bit strange because the usual thing you'll find is that there will be 7s or multiples of 7 in honor of the 7 African powers. This skull was discovered by a little boy who happened to be walking along the railroad tracks, and when the police asked him about the money, it turned out that there was really 7 cents, but he took the nickel and bought candy with it. So,
What can you tell us about these other skulls?
this particular skull was found in an area near a local hospital in a vacant lot and was associated with several other skulls in large cauldrons. Obviously, this particular nganga was meant to be discovered. It was being destroyed or returned to the owner's cemetery or whatnot. The original mythology indicates they were supposed to bring it to the woods, dig a large hole, and bury it. But apparently cauldrons are becoming scarce, and people wonder why you're digging holes in cemeteries these days, so they've been leaving them dismantled in various places, frequently a vacant lot or in a cemetery itself. This particular skull was actually found on top, as I recall, of the cauldron. Another skull was found inside one of the cauldrons. It is also covered with droplets of quicksilver or mercury, and this is used in their religion to help the Kiyumba think faster, and as a result we have the mercury droplets on there. This skull also appears to be that of a black female. Less likely it's of East Indian origin, but looks mostly like that of a black female.
How about the last skull?
This particular skull was found in a cemetery as part of a dismantled nganga. It's covered with a variety of dried insects. It has small amounts of feathers on it as well. And we can't really tell too much else about it, except it does have a portion of decomposing brain remaining inside of it. This skull happens to be that of a black male, and there also appears to be the dried blood or perhaps some charring as part of the rituals. Sometimes they must use gunpowder in this religion for divination purposes.
Dr. Whitley, what can you tell us about this cauldron?
Well, this particular cauldron is relatively small. We have some which are much larger, as a matter of fact. But inside the cauldron is going to be a phenomenal variety of things, everything from syringes to razor blades to lawnmower blades, railroad spikes, horseshoes, avian bones, and human bones. The basic components are, first of all, dirt, usually from a magical source, like a cemetery or the bank of a river or underneath a very large banyan tree or something along those lines. It is then made up and very frequently devoted to a specific god, such as Babaluaye or one of the others, and then it is used for the induction of magic, if you will. The components can be highly varied. In this particular one are stones, which also have their magical significance, a piece of candle. Sometimes it will be magnets because they help the power along. Invariably, you're going to find cowrie shells, pennies, and so forth, because as the cauldron is used, it, if you will, builds up with additional materials, because the gods have to be propitiated. You have to feed them the blood of chickens, you have to give them pennies, that kind of thing. So you can also find avian bones. You might find a turtle skull, a goat skull, just a tremendous array of things, broken portions of glass, and all of this is pretty much individualized depending upon the magic that they want to accomplish at the time. Certain components seem very constant. For example, railroad spikes, obviously quite rusted and so forth, but railroad spikes symbolize one of their gods called Zarabanda in the Congo or Palo Mayombe religion, as opposed to Ogun in the Santeria religion. These are very frequent. Frequently you'll find sticks, because the original origin of the religion was from woods and sticks and so forth, and so 21 sticks are also frequently found. If a crucifix is found in association with a cauldron, it usually means that it has been Christianized and is only devoted to white magic. Otherwise, it's neutral, can be used for either black or white, and in this religion it's usually used for black magic.
Is there evidence of this anywhere else in the United States?
Yes, anytime you're going to have a large population of Latin community, if you will, you're going to find evidence of Santeria, particularly if the congregation or the community happens to be composed of Cubans, Colombians, Brazilians, and so forth. You're going to find evidence of Santeria. It doesn't necessarily mean a criminal, of course, but you will find it. It'll be manifested by the typical statues, the typical beads, evidence of animal sacrifice, and so forth.
What areas of the country are you aware of that have practicing Santerias in it?
Virtually any large metropolitan area has had experience with Santeria. Many times it takes a while to recognize it, but I know of instances which have been reported to me from Chicago, from Los Angeles, from New Jersey, New York, virtually all over the United States.
That was Dr. Charles Wetley, the Dade County coroner, speaking on the subject of Santeria and other occultic practices found today in South Florida and elsewhere. Larry Chilson is a local detective in Miami, and we asked him if he had ever gone out to a house where a complaint had been issued regarding cruelty to animals.
I've been on numerous calls, generally to the same homes that practice the Santeria. And there have been goats, chickens, guinea fowls, pigeons, and I've been told that oxens very rarely are used in their sacrificial ceremonies, and all these animals are killed to divert bad things from the persons or relieve them of their bad sins, so to speak.
Mercedes Sandoval is an anthropologist with a doctorate in that subject. She teaches at a local university and is an acknowledged expert on Santeria from a cultural perspective, especially since learning about it firsthand in her native Cuba many years ago. First, we asked her if Santeria is only a religion for low-income people, or is it accepted by other socioeconomic groups?
Interesting about the Miami phenomena is that Santeria, which is a religion that has its roots in a pre-urban religion, is flourishing in a technological society and is fulfilling the needs of Cubans, most of them of European descent. An African religion that is flourishing among Cubans of European descent. So apparently it's meeting the needs of many people who do not get their needs satisfied in other institutions. I have seen it in Miami as fulfilling different functions. For blacks, for black Cubans, it fulfills a very important function of identity. That's their religion, that's what their ancestors believed in. So it gives them a feeling of wholeness, of ego strength and the like. In the case of Cubans of European descent, it might fulfill different functions. In some instances, people go to Santeria in search of control when they are in their life in a situation of lack of control, ambiguity, lack of mastery and the like. They obtain some control by techniques of manipulating the supernatural, by magical techniques. Also, it gives them control by consulting the supernatural through divination systems, and therefore getting counseling, supernatural counseling, which relieves a lot of the anxiety and gives them also authoritarian counseling. Hispanics in general and Cubans in particular come from authoritarian type of family, and sometimes counseling direct or has the authority of the supernatural can be very much accepted. Yeah, I think it also serves a function of becoming a sort of a supportive system, because the followers of a particular Santero priest are not that numerous, maybe 150, 200. And those followers get to know each other like if they were a fictive family. They really have close kinship ties or fictive kinship ties, and they become a sort of emotional support system and also economic support system. So it has many, many functions that apparently is fulfilling for the followers. Well, Santeria actually is an Afro-Cuban product. Something similar to what happened in Cuba also occurred in Brazil, Umbanda, for instance. However, Santeria, as you know it in here, has spread from Cubans to Dominicans, Puerto Ricans. It has become very popular among Puerto Ricans and all type of Hispanic in the United States. It has also been exported to Central America and also to Venezuela by Cubans. Part of the diaspora has been, or the function of the diaspora has been spreading this. A number of Afro-Americans or Black Americans apparently has also been involved in Santeria long before the Cubans came here in exile. I know, for instance, that there is an Afro-American sort of a church or a religion or a revival system that, you know, they have created sort of like a Yoruba village in the outskirts of North Carolina or South Carolina, I don't remember right now. And the chief there, I met him, he's a very pleasant, cultivated person, told me that he went to Cuba in the 50s, and there he became initiated in a religion that their ancestors probably shared, but that it was lost in the United States.
In your psychiatric practices, have you met people that have taken hexes seriously and have, you know, really affected their lives?
Well, I did research specifically when I was the director of the Cuban unit and of Hispanic services. I was doing research on how religion affects mental health, and in many ways how to bridge the gap in between the native healers and the mental health practitioners. Yes. I remember that at a given time, when I was starting more of the structured type of research, not just observation, but just intensive interviewing and the like, I had a caseload, or the clinic had a caseload of approximately 350 clients a month, maybe 320 or something like that. Of them, at that given time, we identified over 46 of them who were practicing Santeria. And we did not identify them in the sense that we were looking for it. They themselves volunteered that they believed in it and were active practitioners. So that was kind of high, right, at that particular time. We are talking about people that were suffering from mental health problems. We're not talking about the so-called population that was able to cope in a better fashion. So just we met a lot of people that were, you know, they believed that they could be hexed, or that they had been hexed, or they were using all type of amulets for protection and the like.
In observing Santeria rituals, have you ever noticed any examples of possession?
Well, yes, in Santeria I have observed it also in Spiritism. Many Latins practice Spiritism. Actually, you can practically observe it in the religious program that they show in television here on Sundays. Transpossession. Transpossession is a phenomena that is quite common in many different religious systems. It's very prevalent in Africa, more than any place else. You don't find it so much in the European context because it was identified or diagnosed as being possession by the devil. Transpossession, you know, in one way or the other, apparently is due to a state of self-hypnosis, and therefore the individual, through transpossession in many instances, is able to release himself from the pressure of being on control of himself. So it put the individual in a situation of altered state of consciousness. I see it sometimes as being a vehicle of a catharsis that sometimes relieves the tension and allows the individual to act out a lot of the problems that when he's in a situation of full consciousness, he cannot act out. I see in transpossession also in the sense when a priest is under the possession of God, he can counsel, the believers and comfort them with a lot of the authority that the assumed presence of the supernatural will give to whatever words he has of comfort and the counseling for the believers.
That was Dr. Mercedes Sandoval, an expert on Santeria, who has personally witnessed people under direct demonic influence during the Santeria worship experience. As you've seen today, practitioners of Santeria occasionally practice grave robbing to get the skulls and other bones needed for their rituals and worship. Santeria does not have a specific moral code as in the Judeo-Christian tradition, so it is frequently found in association with criminal activities, as Dr. Wetley indicated. Now let's turn our attention to the subject of voodoo. Voodoo is one of several melting pot religions of African origin which is practiced by autonomous occultic groups as a religion, but is difficult to define or provide statistics for because each group, like Santeria, is autonomous. Voodoo and Palo Mayombe are very similar in their origins and beliefs, and it is difficult to distinguish between the two, so we will have to examine them together. Voodoo developed largely in West Africa many years ago and contains elements of Catholicism, as do Palo Mayombe and Santeria. Voodoo and Palo Mayombe, however, are considered to be black magic and purveyors of evil, whereas Santeria is supposedly considered to be more good than evil. In my opinion, and from a biblical perspective, there is no distinction, because in each, one can become possessed by demons. The major centers of voodoo practice today are Haiti, Cuba, Miami, New Orleans, and New York City, just to name a few. Voodoo is also practiced on a large scale in the nation of Brazil. The central focus of voodoo involves a person who practices the ritual by becoming possessed by a number of demons masquerading under the guise of spirits of an African origin. These spirits are called loas in Haiti. In ceremonies led by a hungan, or a male priest, or a mambo, the name for a female priestess, each possessed individual enacts a highly specific ritual performance involving dance, song, and speech appropriate to the particular possessing demon. When the slaves began this practice many years ago, they asked for healings, warding off of evil, and bringing good or evil fortune while under the possession of an evil spirit. Some of them even ceremoniously married a demon in the mistaken belief that the demon would provide them with an ongoing protection in their relationship. As we mentioned, voodoo borrows some of its beliefs from Catholicism, but this process has taken place rather selectively and doesn't play as major a role in voodoo or Palo Mayombe as it does in Santeria. The voodoo ritual calendar follows that of Catholicism, and African voodoo deities are associated with it, although not considered to be equal with various Christian saints. But here again, these are different within the three occultic practices we are discussing. Voodoo worshippers appear to have maintained a great deal of separation between traditional African and borrowed Christian motifs. When our staff was in Miami, we had a chance to visit with Tom Wensky, a Catholic priest who spends most of his time working with people who are confused with the differences between Christianity and voodoo. He counsels with Haitian refugees. Many of these refugees still follow these occultic practices. Since Miami has so many refugees from Cuba, and in particular from Haiti, we wanted to know if he knew anything about the widely publicized voodoo-related incidents on the boat trips from Haiti to the coast of Florida.
People are coming over here, they might have saw, the lack of wind or the, a storm or something having been done to, being a result of, the voodoo gods not being with them or being with them. And there is one story where actually one boat, the Jeshula, that came over here in 1980-81, where some 90 people were thrown overboard by a crazed boat captain who thought that in this way he could, placate the gods in order to achieve a safe voyage.
Are you familiar at all with the black side of voodoo?
Well, there are, negative aspects of voodoo in the sense that, as a religion, I would pull for Christianity because it's really, where I think the human spirit can find, true freedom. Voodoo, because of people looking for protection, it's a religion of fear. You could say that people are always afraid of of something happening to them, and they come to to the voodoo spirits seeking protection, not as coming to like the Christian God of love. So there is some elements, some of the loi, as the voodoo spirits are called, that are less benevolent, and so there are groups of these gods that are less benevolent than others. You have two main categories, which would be like the Rada gods, which are the more benevolent ones, and the Petro gods, which are the more malevolent ones.
Is there a connection between voodoo and the Roman Catholic ritual, and if so, what is the connection?
Well, I think the only connection would be a superficial one, in the sense that when the slaves came to Africa, when the slaves came from Africa and arrived in Haiti, they were not free to practice their own religion, their African religions. And oftentimes they were brought into the churches and were baptized without having the Christian faith explained to them. And because of their own lack of religious freedom, they had to practice their religion, but at the same time make the white masters think that they were practicing Christianity. So that is how some elements of Christianity or Catholicism, like the Lord's Prayer, would have a place in a voodoo ritual. So that's how certain things came to be blended together. Also, you would have sometimes like in the countryside that people might come to church, to pray for a deceased relative, and then after leaving church would go home and continue, the prayers, but not so much from a Christian inspiration, but again from a voodoo inspiration, of preparing, special food for the deceased person, leaving it at the cemetery as an offering for the deceased person to help him, get to, his the land of their ancestors, Guinea, as it's called, which is sort of like the African equivalent of our paradise.
That was Tom Wensky, a Roman Catholic priest, commenting on the subject of voodoo in southern Florida. Now I need to prepare you for what you're about to see, because it's not exactly pleasant. Again, I would like to caution you that if small children are viewing this program at this time, you may not wish to have them view this segment of our program. What you are about to see is part of a voodoo ceremony taped on a sandbar near Port-au-Prince, Haiti. It is unedited, and our cameraman concealed himself in the bushes to record it. The woman who is dancing around here is falling into a state of demonic possession. Watch closely. That you found the preceding scene revolting, as I did. It's obvious that only a crazed and demon-possessed person would bite the head off a living bird. However, this is just a portion of a voodoo ceremony. This goes on all the time when people who practice voodoo get together to call up demons, which they call the spirits of the dead. In most instances, the magic is used to inflict misfortune, such as insanity, divorce, or even death upon an enemy or the enemy of a client. The so-called high priests of voodoo use a scepter made of a human tibia bone wrapped in a black cloth to rule over the powers of darkness. Both voodoo and Palo Mayombe make use of human remains, especially skulls, in their worship. As we've mentioned, there's a definite link between many of these occultic practices and crime. Dennis Bauer, who is an assistant district attorney for Los Angeles County, was interviewed for this series. We asked Dennis, how can the average person identify someone in an occultic group who might be involved in criminal activity?
There are three basic ways to identify gang members in general. It's their dress, or the way they groom themselves, by the tattoos that they wear, and the graffiti that they leave around the neighborhood.
Can you give us some more details about some of the occultic groups, how you can identify them?
Well, basically, you'll see graffiti in the occultic group areas. The basic gang group that we believe is related to occult is called the Stoners, and they are a generalized group that has activities in various areas. But we see their graffiti on the walls, and it's usually graffiti with either the satanic S, which is a lightning bolt. There's a cross, or upside down cross with a question mark, which is a symbol for, actually it's a slander against Christ's crucifixion, a question who really did die on the cross. The 666 or 666, which is the sign of the beast or the devil, a goat's head symbol, and there are some others, a pentagram.
What makes the Stoners different from other gangs?
The Stoners are probably the gang grouping that we know the least about, because their activities are more covert than the other groups. One of the things that's typical about gangs, street gangs, in their graffiti is that they use their graffiti to mark off their territories. They'll write their gang names and their names of their gang members, usually their gang name, which is not the real name. They'll have nicknames like Loco, Wimpy, Chuto, all sorts of different names. In their territoriality, when they mark off their territory by these graffiti writings, one of the things that they'll do is cross out other gangs' graffiti both as a challenge and an insult to the other group. Now they do that, that sometimes generates gang warfare, retaliation, shootings back and forth, and other types of more graffiti, etc. I've never seen Stoner graffiti crossed out, and we believe that's because they are so feared by other street gangs that nobody would be caught crossing out their graffiti.
What activities do occultic groups engage in?
Well, the occultic groups engage in a variety of para-religious activities, but the main activities that I would become involved in are activities which are criminal in nature, such as grave desecrations, graffiti, church graffiti on church grounds, even animal sacrifices, which would be cruelty to animals, and things of that nature. As part of satanic worship, if it's followed to its extreme, and not all the groups, or not all the members of all the groups are even aware of what the ground rules are. The higher echelons know what the ground rules or what the ultimate objectives are of Satan worship. One of the things that is involved in Satan worship is animal sacrifice and even live human sacrifice. Now there is evidence that there has been animal sacrifice in the neighboring counties. Our fear is that with perhaps kidnapping of children, it could lead to even live human sacrifice.
What can be done about this problem?
Well, parents can become more involved in what their adolescent children are doing, more involved perhaps into an older age. I think most parents are involved with their children up to the ages of junior high school, and then when the children become more independent, the parents back off more. I think it's a natural process of the child also taking on its own identity, the transfer from the authority of other people to the child's own authority. I think that's probably one of the biggest problems.
Do you see any real evidence that young people are turning to Satan worship in the occult in Southern California, and can you give us some examples?
Yes, I do believe that there is. I don't know that the children realize what they're getting into a lot of times, because it's a very subtle, it's almost a subtle ignorance approach, I would call it, not in a derogatory towards the person type of remark, but they just really don't realize what they're getting into. A lot of the rock groups, for instance, have satanic symbols that are associated with their groups. And these symbols are very frequently found on the T-shirts that the children are wearing, and even on the tattoos that some of the older children, servicemen particularly, wear on their bodies. And further evidence is the graffiti that you find in the areas where some of the gang members, the youthful gang members, are involved.
What is chiefly responsible for the Renaissance in Satanism by these young people today?
I think that the Renaissance, again, is all related to this identity crisis that the adolescents go through. And related to that is probably the commercialism of people who are able to sell the bizarre to our children. If the children are looking for acceptance within a peer group, and the heavy metal rock is what's being displayed for them to buy, and it is bizarre, and it's anti-establishment, then it's more acceptable, to the point that the more bizarre it is, the more acceptable it is to someone who is trying to break away and find his own identity. Most of us went through that at some stage, perhaps not to the degree that the children are now with their exposure to Satanism, but we went through rock and roll and cars and other things to the point that we survived that. We went through a transitional period and we took on our own responsibility, our own discipline of ourselves. And I don't think that we were confronted with the same dangers that the children are now becoming involved in Satan worship.
Is Satan worship coming out in the open now?
Yes, I believe it is coming out in the open. For instance, the T-shirts that the children are wearing, which emulate the rock groups, frequently have satanic symbols on them. The satanic S, which is found between the symbols AC and DC, it's a lightning bolt. It's also found in the name of the rock group KISS, K-I-S-S. The last two S's are the satanic lightning bolt. You'll see pentagrams. Goat's Head Soup is even the name of a rock group album from about 10 years ago now, but the goat's head is a symbol of Satanism. Again, the graffiti, the things that the children wear, and also the actual words on rock albums. Parents need to take a more active role in the upbringing of their children through the adolescent stages. They need to be more understanding. They need to become involved in their activities, their music, their dress, and to realize that getting into a group, a gang, is a symptom of a problem the child is going through. And that problem can be lessened by an understanding parent. And just like being a member of a group or a gang can be like a habit, like smoking, that can be broken. A lot of habits are broken not by getting rid of the habit, but by substituting it for something else. Many people who used to be chain smokers now chew a lot of gum. The same thing can happen, and probably my suggestion to help children not become involved or to break their involvement with these groups, which can have very dangerous consequences if followed to the extreme, is to have a parent who is involved with their children enough so that the child has enough activities to make them feel accepted, to make them feel like they're gaining control of their own circumstances and that they're happy in a productive way and not in a destructive way that can come from following the Satanist worship.
Thank you, Dennis Bauer. I believe that Dennis has offered some really good advice. Today we've just scratched the surface with the problem of the occult. What should all of this mean for a Christian? We have to approach this subject in view of the results that occultism has achieved, as well as its effectiveness. What is the purpose of these peculiar practices? To predict the future and to have power? It's very clear that there are many hidden desires and many hidden practices we know nothing about. When we look at the Bible for the interpretation of all of this, we find that the future belongs to God. And there is good news. In all of this darkness, God has given us the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verses 27 and 28, we see that there is a marvelous picture of how God dealt with the many things we've been talking about today. In verse 28, we are told that there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets and makes known things because it is He to whom interpretation belongs. What else should a believer in Christ need? It is my prayer that God will give you spiritual discernment. If you encounter the weird world of the occult, your strength, your victory is in the Word of God and in the Holy Spirit and in the power that God has given to the church. In the words of the Lord Jesus, behold, I give you power over the demons. They are in subjection to you in my name. But Jesus also said that we should rejoice that our names were written in heaven, not that the demons were subject to us. Goodbye, and may God richly bless you in your study of His Word.
Well, old Buddha was a man, and I'm sure that he meant well, but I pray